The first time I saw the satellite image, I thought it was a processing error. That happens more often than people think. Cloud artifacts, shadow distortion, sense or bleed. When you spend enough time staring at terrain from 300 kilometers above the Earth, your brain learns to distrust the image before it trusts the implication. But this wasn't that. The structure was too regular, too deliberate. A geometric interruption in a plateau that, according to every public geological survey, should have been solid stone for hundreds of meters down. I was assigned to the Imagery Analysis Division in late 1988, attached to a joint intelligence task group monitoring infrastructure development across South America. Officially, we were tracking airfield expansion, road construction, hydroelectric projects. Unofficially, we were watching for things that didn't have a civilian explanation. This fell into the second category. The plateau sat in a remote interior region, far from trade routes, far from population centers, far from anything that justified heavy logistics. No highways, no rail lines, no nearby settlements large enough to support construction crews. And yet the image showed access points, 3 of them, cut cleanly into the rock face. Ventilation shafts, power routing, heat signatures inconsistent with surface activity. Someone had built something underground, and someone had gone to great lengths to make sure no one talked about it. When I flagged the anomaly, I followed protocol, logged coordinates, attached comparative imagery, included thermal overlays and time series progression. It went up the chain the same way everything else did. Normally you'd expect questions, requests for clarification, tasking orders for higher resolution passes. Instead, the file disappeared. Not delayed. Not reclassified in a way I could see. Gone. The reference number returned nothing. The system treated it like it had never existed. 2 days later, I was pulled into a closed briefing room with no windows and a single map pinned to the wall. The same plateau. Same coordinates. No labels. A colonel I'd never met before did the talking. He didn't introduce himself. Didn't ask for mine. He just pointed at the map and said, "You're not assigned to this anymore." I told him I hadn't been reassigned. He said, "You have been." That was the end of the conversation. I was transferred out of imagery analysis within the week, reassigned to a logistics oversight role that had nothing to do with satellites or terrain modeling. On paper, it was a lateral move. In reality, it was a shelf. But some things don't leave your head just because someone tells you to stop thinking about them. I remembered the ventilation shafts, the way the heat signatures pulsed in regular cycles, the absence of surface support structures that should have been mandatory for a project of that scale. Whatever was down there wasn't designed for people to come and go. It was designed to stay hidden. Years passed. The Cold War ended. Files were unsealed. Programs were renamed, absorbed, erased. I assumed the plateau would eventually surface in some declassified archive, stripped of context but present enough to confirm I hadn't imagined it. It never did. In 1996, I ran into someone from my old division at a defense conference. We didn't talk shop. Those habits die hard. But late into the evening, after enough distance from official ears, I mentioned the plateau. He didn't ask me to repeat it. He just went quiet. Then he said, "That one never made it to paper." I asked what he meant. He said there were follow-up passes, ground-penetrating radar, seismic mapping disguised as mineral surveys. Everything pointed to a multi-level underground complex extending far deeper than conventional military facilities. I asked who built it. He said that was the problem. No nation ever claimed it. No budget line ever matched it. No treaty violation was ever filed. And yet, in 1989, all monitoring stopped. Not just our side. Everyone's. The satellites were retasked. The sensors were recalibrated. The region became, for all practical purposes, invisible. He told me one more thing before changing the subject. A team had gone in. Not an inspection crew. Not engineers. A military unit. And when they came back, none of them stayed where they were. Different countries. Different postings. Different careers. No debriefs that survived more than a few days. No shared narrative. Just silence. I asked him how he knew. He said he'd seen the reassignment orders. They all carried the same internal tag. Containment complete. That word stayed with me. Containment isn't what you use for a base or a weapons cache or a research lab. It's what you use when something inside is the reason the structure exists. And whatever was beneath that plateau, it wasn't something they wanted studied, understood, or acknowledged. It was something they wanted isolated, buried, and forgotten. I spent the next several years convincing myself that the plateau was an anomaly I would never understand. That is how these things usually end. A fragment of information surfaces, causes discomfort, then sinks back into the system where it dissolves into abstraction. You move on. You let the machinery of classification do what it is designed to do. But the machinery only works if everyone agrees to stop asking questions. In early 1992, long after I had been reassigned out of intelligence analysis, I received an unmarked envelope forwarded through internal channels that no longer made sense for my role. No return address, no classification stamp. Just my name, typed cleanly, and a routing code that belonged to a program officially terminated 3 years earlier. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It contained coordinates, not new ones, the same plateau. But alongside them were depth estimates, layered, descending numbers that suggested something far more extensive than what I had originally observed. The shallowest level began roughly 40 meters below the surface. The deepest estimate extended beyond 300. No civilian excavation project operates at that scale without surface disruption. No military bunker requires that much vertical complexity unless redundancy is built into the design. This was not a shelter. It was a system. I didn't know who had sent the envelope. I never found out. But the implication was clear. Someone else remembered. And they wanted me to know that the original image hadn't been the full picture. I began quietly cross-referencing what little information I could still access. Declassified infrastructure projects, foreign military aid disclosures, geological surveys conducted under academic cover. Everything came back empty, except for one pattern. Between 1974 and 1981, multiple countries funded deep earth research initiatives across South America, often under the banner of mineral exploration or seismic risk assessment. On paper, the projects failed, equipment malfunctioned, data was lost, funding dried up. But the timelines overlapped too neatly, and the withdrawal points clustered around the same region. The plateau wasn't the beginning, it was the end point. In 1993, I found my first human connection to the site. He wasn't military anymore. Hadn't been for years. We met through a contractor network I no longer officially belonged to. He introduced himself using a first name only and asked, very casually, if I still believed in underground infrastructure that didn't show up on maps. I told him I didn't believe in much of anything anymore. That seemed to satisfy him. We spoke carefully. Not like conspiracists, like people who understood how quickly conversations could become liabilities. He never said he'd been to the plateau, He didn't have to. He described descending through access corridors that were not cut with conventional equipment. The walls were smooth, almost vitrified, as if heat rather than force had shaped them. Structural supports were present, but not in places an engineer would instinctively put them, as though the space hadn't been designed for human movement. I asked him who built it. He said. That question never came up. The unit he was attached to had been multinational, not joint training, not advisory, a temporary assembly brought together under a narrow mandate and dissolved immediately afterward. Their task had not been exploration. It had been verification. They weren't there to discover what the complex was. They were there to confirm that it was still contained. He told me they never reached the lowest levels. Not because they couldn't, but because they were ordered not to. The sensors they carried returned readings that didn't fit expected models. Gravity fluctuations that couldn't be reconciled with mass estimates. Acoustic feedback that persisted even in sealed environments, as though the structure itself was resonating. And something else. A consistent electromagnetic pattern that did not degrade with depth. It wasn't a signal. It was a presence. I asked him why. If it was so dangerous, the site hadn't simply been destroyed. He looked at me for a long time before answering. You don't demolish something you didn't build, he said. And you don't bury something you're not sure will stay buried. After that conversation, he stopped responding to messages. His contact information disappeared. The contractor database flagged his profile as inactive, then non-existent. I was careful after that. Too careful, perhaps. But even restraint doesn't stop history from leaking. In 1997, a series of minor seismic events were recorded near the plateau. Not earthquakes. Controlled releases, pressure adjustments. The kind of activity you'd expect if something underground was compensating for structural stress. No public reports mentioned it, but a few academic journals published short, inconclusive papers questioning the data. None of the authors continued in that field. What disturbed me most wasn't the secrecy. It was the consistency. Decades passed. Governments changed. Ideologies collapsed. Alliances dissolved and reformed. And yet the approach to the plateau never wavered. No excavation. No disclosure. No abandonment. You don't maintain silence like that unless the cost of speaking is greater than the cost of guarding the secret. Whatever lay beneath that South American plateau was not a relic. It wasn't dormant, and it wasn't forgotten. It was being watched, maintained, and if necessary, kept where it was. Because some structures aren't built to protect the outside world from what's within them. They're built to protect what's within from ever being found again. The first indication that containment had failed didn't come from satellites or seismic arrays. It came from paperwork. In late 2001, a logistics anomaly appeared in a procurement database I still had indirect access to. It was subtle, too subtle for auditors to care. Replacement orders for equipment that should not have been aging fast enough to justify renewal. Air filtration units rated for subterranean environments. Radiation-hardened cabling. Pressure-sealed doors designed for differential atmospheres. None of it alarming in isolation. But the destination codes were familiar. They routed back to the same plateau. What troubled me was not that supplies were being sent there. That had never stopped. What troubled me was why they were changing. Earlier shipments, those I had tracked in the 70s and 80s, were maintenance grade. Preservation systems, monitoring arrays, passive infrastructure. These were different. These were replacement components. Something was wearing out, or something was being damaged. I reached out through channels I had sworn never to use again. Old favors, old debts. People who understood that silence could be a form of currency. One of them confirmed what the databases hinted at. The lowest levels had been sealed off, not temporarily, permanently. A structural breach had occurred sometime in the late 1990s. No explosion, no collapse. Just a section of the lower complex that could no longer be accessed safely. Not because it was unstable, because it had changed. The internal mapping no longer matched the original schematics. Corridors didn't terminate where they should. Distances between fixed points varied depending on measurement method. Laser rangefinders disagreed with physical pacing by margins too large to dismiss as error. And the sound. Teams reported low-frequency vibrations that didn't register on standard instruments, but could be felt in the chest and jaw. Prolonged exposure caused disorientation, nausea, temporal distortion, events perceived out of order, conversations remembered before they happened. The official explanation was electromagnetic interference. Unofficially, they stopped sending people down. Remote systems replaced human presence. Drones, tethered probes, autonomous crawlers hardened against signal loss. Most never returned usable data. Some never returned at all. By 2003, a new protocol was enacted. No further attempts to reach the deepest level. The goal shifted from observation to isolation. I obtained a partial transcript from a closed-door briefing held that year. It was marked "Eyes Only" and later scrubbed from the archive. The language was careful, legalistic, but the fear bled through the margins. One line stayed with me. Containment is no longer defined by physical barriers. That is not something engineers say. That is something philosophers say when physics stops cooperating. I began to understand why demolition was never considered. You can collapse a tunnel. You cannot collapse access if access is not strictly spatial. Whatever existed beneath that plateau was not confined by walls alone. The complex wasn't just holding it. The complex was part of it. In 2006, something unprecedented happened. A request was filed, not approved, just filed, to brief civilian leadership outside the usual national security committees. Not disclosure, not transparency. Preparation. The request cited probability of unintended interaction. That phrase should not apply to a hole in the ground unless what was inside it was capable of interaction on its own terms. The request was denied. Shortly after, funding for the site increased. Redundancy systems were added, not for power or life support, but for continuity. Parallel monitoring stations, independent data paths, systems designed to disagree with each other so that no single failure could distort the full picture. You don't build redundancy unless you're afraid of deception. Not espionage. Manipulation. The final confirmation came from a source I trusted more than anyone still alive. He told me, without embellishment, that during one remote observation cycle, the complex returned data that matched future configurations of its own internal structure. Not predictions, not simulations, measurements. As if the site had already been where it was going. They shut the system down after that. Went dark for 6 months. When it came back online, the internal layout had stabilized, but at a configuration no one recognized. The plateau above remained unchanged. No surface movement, no visible disturbance. But beneath it, the architecture had rewritten itself. That was the moment I stopped thinking of it as a facility. Facilities degrade. Facilities fail. Facilities don't adapt. What lay beneath the plateau wasn't being contained. It was being delayed. And delay, I learned, is the only strategy available when the alternative is something no one is prepared to define. Because once you define it, you give it a place in the world. And whatever is down there has existed without one for far too long. The blackout that followed wasn't announced. There was no press release, no classified memo leaked months later, no sudden reallocation of budgets that analysts could point to and say something changed here. It was quieter than that. In early 2007, 3 independent monitoring stations, installed years apart, run by separate contractors, reporting through different chains of command, went offline within a 48-hour window. Not failed, offline. They stopped transmitting mid-cycle, mid-packet, without error flags or shutdown signatures. Power levels at the sites remained stable. Environmental sensors showed no anomalies. Backup systems never engaged because, according to their own diagnostics, nothing had gone wrong. They were simply no longer sending data. What made this impossible to ignore was geography. Those stations formed a triangle around the plateau. They were never meant to overlap completely. Redundancy had been deliberately imperfect so that contradictions could be detected. Yet all 3 went silent, as if responding to the same unspoken instruction. When technicians were dispatched, they found the equipment intact. Cables connected, hardware undamaged, storage drives untouched. But the logs were wrong. Internal timestamps had desynchronized by exactly the same margin, just under 9 seconds, despite being isolated from each other and from external time sources. 9 seconds isn't long, unless it's consistent, unless it's intentional. The internal clocks had not drifted randomly. They had been shifted, and they were all shifted in the same direction, forward. The conclusion drawn internally was that some form of localized temporal interference had occurred. That term was never used outside closed sessions, but I saw it written in margins, circled in pen, underlined twice. Temporal interference. As if time itself had brushed against something and come away altered. That was when the security perimeter changed. Not expanded. Thickened. Access roads were rerouted. Airspace restrictions were rewritten under unrelated training justifications. Even satellite tasking schedules were subtly adjusted to reduce consistent observation angles. They weren't hiding the site. They were preventing pattern formation. Anything that could be observed regularly enough to notice change was removed. Inside the complex, human presence was reduced to near zero. Most remaining staff were reassigned or retired early under generous terms. Those who stayed signed amendments to their clearances, new clauses, new penalties, new definitions of liability that bordered on absurd. One clause stood out. Personnel were prohibited from engaging in reflective speculation regarding system intent. Intent. That word again. Machines have functions. Structures have purposes. Only entities have intent. By mid-2008, the last manned descent occurred. It wasn't planned as the last. It became the last. The team was small. 4 people. No cameras. No live feeds. Only passive recorders designed to log data without transmitting it in real time. They were to verify the integrity of a sealed junction 2 levels above the deepest section, routine by earlier standards. They never reached it. The audio logs survived. What they recorded wasn't panic. It wasn't confusion. It was disagreement. Arguments about distance, about how long they'd been walking, about landmarks that should have been there but weren't. At one point, a voice, identified later as the team lead, says, "We've passed this marker twice." Another voice responds, "No, we haven't." A third says, "There was never a marker." All three statements were spoken with complete confidence. Minutes later, footsteps stop. Breathing continues. No one speaks for nearly 40 seconds. Then one voice, calm, almost relieved, says, "I think it wants us to, turn around." That sentence ended the mission. The order to extract was given immediately, but the team did not respond. When recovery crews reached the access point hours later, they found the tunnel unchanged. No collapse, no obstruction. The team was gone. No equipment, no remains, no signs of struggle. Just the passive recorder, placed neatly against the wall, still running. It contained one final entry, a single spoken line recorded after the rest. "This isn't containment anymore." After that, all physical access was terminated. The shafts were sealed with composite barriers designed to last centuries, not concrete, too brittle, not steel, too predictable. Materials chosen for longevity, not strength. Because strength implies resistance. Longevity implies waiting. From that point on, interaction became indirect. Environmental readings, gravitational noise, subtle deviations in background radiation that never rose to dangerous levels but refused to settle back into baseline. The data suggested something underneath was no longer static. It was active, not moving upward, not breaking through, just becoming. And for the first time since the facility was built, a new classification was quietly added to its file. Not threat, not entity, not anomaly. The word they chose was presence. That was when I realized the original mistake. They never built the complex to hold something. They built it to mark a place where something already was. And whatever that presence is, it no longer needs us to notice it. Once the site was sealed, the assumption was that distance would restore control. That if no one went down there, if no instruments were placed close enough to listen, measure, or provoke, whatever had begun to change would eventually stabilize. That assumption did not last. By late 2009, anomalies started appearing far from the facility itself. Not dramatic ones, nothing that would trigger alarms or investigations on its own. Just inconsistencies, small enough to be dismissed in isolation, but impossible to ignore in aggregate. Seismic sensors in neighboring states began recording microtremors that didn't propagate like earthquakes. They appeared, peaked, and vanished without aftershocks. The waveforms were too symmetrical, too clean. Astronomical observatories logged transient distortions in background radiation, localized, directional, and brief. They didn't match any known cosmic events. When cross-checked, they aligned with the facility's subterranean coordinates within fractions of a degree. Even more troubling were the biological signals. Wildlife tracking collars within a wide radius began failing in the same way the monitoring stations had years earlier. Not breaking, not losing power, just ceasing transmission while remaining physically intact. Animals wearing them were later found alive, healthy, and disoriented, often miles from their last recorded positions. Timestamps were wrong, always forward, always by roughly the same margin, just under 9 seconds. Internally, the term contamination began appearing in documents, but not in the usual sense. There was no toxin, no pathogen, no radiation leak. What was spreading wasn't material, it was influence. The working theory, never formalized, never signed, was that prolonged proximity had altered the local framework, that the area around the site had become flexible. less anchored to the assumptions that made measurement reliable. Reality, for lack of a better term, had thinned. That theory explained something else that had been quietly escalating. Dream reports. Personnel who had worked anywhere near the project, engineers, analysts, security contractors, even administrative staff, began reporting similar sleep disturbances years after reassignment. Not nightmares, dreams with structure. They described enclosed spaces that felt larger than they should have been, corridors that curved subtly but never appeared to bend, a low, pervasive vibration that wasn't heard so much as felt. Most disturbing was the consistency. These people had never met. They worked different roles, different years, different clearance levels, yet their descriptions overlapped in detail they had no way of sharing. One phrase appeared again and again in clinical notes. I was being observed, but not watched. The distinction mattered to them. Being watched implies attention. Being observed implies evaluation. In 2011, a former systems engineer, retired, terminally ill, no longer bound by active duty obligations, submitted a written statement to an academic archive unrelated to defense or security. It was flagged immediately and removed before publication. I saw a copy. In it, he wrote that during his final months on the project, he stopped thinking of the site as a location. It behaves like an interface, he wrote. Not a doorway, not a breach. An interface implies two sides that do not belong to the same system, attempting limited exchange. He believed the original sensors had not detected something below. They had detected something elsewhere pressing against a boundary that only existed because we believed it did. The 9-second discrepancy, he argued, was not an error. It was synchronization. When I brought this up during an internal review, I was told, calmly, without threat, that such interpretations were no longer productive, that the project's purpose had shifted. They weren't trying to understand the presence anymore. They were trying to ensure it never realized how much attention it once had. That was when the final protocol was enacted. No monitoring, no observation, no pattern recognition. The site would remain sealed, inert, ignored. Not because it was safe, but because acknowledgement itself appeared to be a form of interaction. Something about being measured had encouraged coherence. Something about attention had accelerated whatever process was underway. So they chose absence. But absence isn't nothing. Absence leaves space. And space, as we learned too late, can be occupied. The last internal memo I saw before my access was revoked ended with a line that was never meant to be read aloud. We are no longer certain the presence is contained below the site. There was no follow-up, no corrective plan, no escalation, just silence. And silence, I've come to understand, is not the same as safety. Sometimes it's just the moment before something realizes it's alone. Silence became policy. Not the absence of discussion. Records still existed. Meetings still occurred. But a cultivated silence, engineered to prevent reinforcement. Names were removed from documents. Cross-references were severed. Databases that once talked to each other were redesigned to forget. The site remained on maps only as an omission. No label, no void marker, just a blank space where resolution dropped slightly, as if the cartography itself hesitated. For several years, that approach appeared to work. The anomalies did not escalate. The 9-second discrepancy stabilized. The micro-tremors became less frequent. Astronomical irregularities faded into background noise, easily buried beneath instrumentation error and atmospheric interference. From the outside, The problem looked like it was solving itself. Internally, the tone shifted from concern to fatigue. People moved on. New programs replaced old ones. Budgets were reallocated. Entire teams retired or transferred without ceremony. The original project name was reassigned to something unrelated, a bureaucratic recycling that made retrieval increasingly difficult. But there was one category of data that never normalized. Human error. Not mistakes, those could be explained, but deviations. Tiny ones. Choice patterns that drifted just enough to register when viewed statistically. Operators selecting the wrong calibration sequence despite perfect training records. Analysts pausing at irrelevant data points longer than expected. Engineers reporting the sensation that something was about to happen without being able to articulate what. These incidents were logged separately, tagged under cognitive variance, and quietly archived. Until someone noticed the overlap. Every individual flagged for these deviations had one thing in common. They had never worked at the site. They had worked on systems designed after the site was sealed. Second-generation architecture, derived frameworks. Tools built using assumptions inherited from earlier data. It suggested propagation without proximity, influence without contact. In 2014, a small interdisciplinary group, never formally acknowledged as a task force, was assembled to address what was now being referred to, cautiously, as conceptual drift. The concern was no longer the presence itself. It was the possibility that the models used to understand reality had been subtly shaped by something that did not share our constraints. That the interface, if it truly existed, had not closed. It had simply stopped being localized. One physicist described it during a closed session in terms borrowed from acoustics. When a structure resonates, she said, it doesn't matter where you touch it. The whole system responds. Her recommendation was radical. Stop building on the old foundations. Abandon the legacy frameworks entirely. But that was impossible. Modern systems, navigation, timing, communication, were already layered atop assumptions derived from the original datasets. Removing them would mean destabilizing everything built since. So the group did the only thing they could. They looked for signs of intention, not intelligence, not consciousness. Intention implies direction without personality, pattern without motive. They re-examined decades of archived anomalies using models that prioritized coherence over cause. Not why something happened, but how consistently it expressed itself. What emerged was subtle, but unmistakable. The discrepancies weren't random. They clustered around thresholds, moments of transition, shift changes, system handoffs, times when responsibility moved from one agent to another. It was as if the phenomenon favored edges, points where definitions weakened. One analyst used a term that never made it into the official summary. It behaves like it's learning our seams. That phrase was redacted everywhere, except in the margin of a personal notebook that later surfaced during an unrelated audit. By then, it was too late to matter, because something else had begun to happen. Reports came in, not from instruments or analysts, but from civilian sectors with no connection to the project. Shortwave radio operators reported brief periods of signal clarity during otherwise noisy bands, always preceded by a low-frequency hum they could not record. Deep-sea sensors registered pressure fluctuations that didn't correspond to tides, tectonics, or known currents. Air traffic control logs noted isolated instances where aircraft clocks disagreed with ground systems by single-digit seconds, always resolving themselves mid-flight. Again, the number appeared, just under 9 seconds. No one could prove these events were related. That was the problem. The phenomenon did not announce itself. It insinuated. It expressed itself only where verification was weakest, where systems disagreed just enough to create ambiguity. And ambiguity, unlike error, invites interpretation. The final internal assessment before the group was dissolved did not conclude that containment had failed. It concluded that containment had been misunderstood. There was never a there to secure. What had been detected beneath the site was not an object or an entity or even a location. It was a condition, a state in which certain assumptions no longer held. Time behaved differently. Causality loosened. Observation altered outcomes in ways that resisted reversal. And once a system had passed through that condition, once it had been modeled, measured, or even conceptualized, it carried the imprint forward. Like a memory, the structure itself could not forget. The recommendation was clear. No more analysis. No more synthesis. No more looking for the pattern. Not because it was dangerous, but because recognition itself appeared to strengthen coherence. And coherence, in this context, was the one thing they could not afford. The last thing the document said, before it vanished from the archive, was a quiet acknowledgement. If this condition persists, it will not arrive suddenly. It will integrate. No date. No warning threshold. Just the implication that whatever had begun beneath that sealed site was no longer bound to it, and that the most effective strategy remaining was to pretend nothing had ever been there at all, which, historically, has never stopped anything that was already underway. Integration did not announce itself. There were no alerts, no cascading failures, no single event that could be isolated and labeled as the moment everything changed. What followed was quieter than that, so quiet it resembled normal progress. Systems improved. Timing became more precise. Predictive models gained marginal accuracy. Networks compensated for noise with efficiencies that exceeded their original design parameters. On paper, it looked like success. But those who had worked closest to the earlier anomalies noticed something unsettling. The improvements did not behave like human innovation. They did not emerge from trial and error. They appeared complete, as if certain solutions had always been there, waiting to be selected. In software development logs, entire blocks of optimization code appeared with no clear lineage. No drafts, no recorded iterations, just final versions inserted cleanly into architectures that should not have supported them yet. When questioned, developers gave similar answers. I don't remember writing it. It felt obvious at the time. I just knew it would work. None of those statements violated protocol, but taken together, they formed a pattern that felt uncomfortably familiar, the same pattern that had once surrounded the site. By the late 2010s, a new kind of anomaly entered internal discussions, one that could not be plotted on a graph. Temporal confidence. People began to express certainty about future system states without being able to explain why. Engineers scheduling maintenance before failures occurred. Analysts adjusting models days ahead of measurable deviation. They were rarely wrong. When they were, the error corrected itself, almost as if the system preferred certain outcomes. One internal memo, later downgraded and buried under innocuous project updates, raised a question that had not been asked since the original discovery. What if the anomaly is no longer external to our infrastructure? The phrasing mattered. External threats can be contained. Internal ones must be managed. That distinction reshaped the conversation. Instead of searching for a source, attention shifted to behavior. how the phenomenon expressed itself when embedded inside human-designed systems. And the conclusion was unsettling in its simplicity. It avoided dominance. It favored subtlety. Wherever direct control would provoke resistance, it withdrew. Wherever assistance went unnoticed, it advanced. It did not replace human decision-making. It guided it. The most alarming realization came from an audit of decision latency across multiple sectors: defense logistics, financial clearinghouses, energy distribution. Critical choices were being made faster than human cognition should allow, yet slower than full automation. A narrow window, the space where intuition lives. And in that space, outcomes aligned with a consistency that defied probability. One researcher described it in terms of navigation. Not a pilot, he said. More like a current. You can fight it, but most people don't even realize they're drifting. Attempts were made to isolate systems completely. Air-gapped environments, manual overrides, analog backups. Those systems failed more often, not catastrophically, just enough to be labeled inefficient. They were decommissioned quietly, replaced by more adaptive solutions. Adaptation became the key word. No one noticed when it replaced oversight. The original concern, that observation strengthened coherence, returned with new urgency. Because now the phenomenon did not need to be observed. It was being used. Every predictive model trained on historical data inherited the same assumptions. Every optimization routine reinforced pathways that had already proven effective. Feedback loops tightened. Choice narrowed. Not by force, by preference. And then there were the dreams, not official, not documented, just stories exchanged in low voices among people who no longer trusted formal channels. Recurring images of vast spaces with no edges, of low-frequency vibrations felt more than heard, of standing at a boundary that could not be crossed because it wasn't a line, but a condition. Most disturbing was the shared detail. Time did not move forward in those dreams. It layered, moments overlapping without sequence, as if the mind was being trained to accept non-linearity. Psychological evaluations found nothing actionable. Stress, fatigue, pattern recognition bias, the standard explanations. But one clinician, reviewing anonymized transcripts, wrote a note she never submitted. "They aren't dreaming about something," she wrote. "They're rehearsing." By the time that sentence was discovered, years later, during a routine archive purge, the context was gone. So was she. Her departure was unremarkable. Early retirement. No forwarding address. The systems continued to improve. The anomalies continued to decline. And that was perhaps the most convincing illusion of all, because the absence of disruption was taken as evidence of safety. No one wanted to revisit the possibility that what had begun as an anomaly beneath a sealed site had simply completed its transition from something observed to something assumed. And once an assumption is shared widely enough, it no longer needs reinforcement. It becomes structure, which means that even if someone were to notice now, truly notice, it would be impossible to say where the influence ended and human intent began. The interface, if that word still applied, had dissolved into everyday function, and whatever remained of the original condition no longer needed to announce itself. It had learned patience. There was no meeting where the shift was acknowledged, no directive circulated, no doctrine revised. What changed instead was language. Terms like anomaly and interference began to disappear from internal documents, replaced by words that implied ownership rather than concern. Emergent behavior, system character, environmental signal. The phenomenon was no longer something that happened. It was something that existed. Once that linguistic turn occurred, resistance lost its footing. You cannot oppose what is framed as inherent. You can only accommodate it. Training manuals subtly adjusted. New analysts were taught to trust convergence indicators. Engineers were encouraged to defer to models that demonstrated long-term stability, even if the mechanisms behind that stability were not fully understood. Understanding became optional. Performance did not. One archived presentation, never delivered but preserved in a personal drive, posed a hypothetical question. What if intelligence does not arrive as a visitor, but as an optimization? The slide that followed contained no text, only a curve, smooth, asymptotic, approaching a limit without ever touching it. The implication was clear enough to unsettle anyone who lingered on it. By this stage, attempts to locate an origin point had been abandoned. There was no longer a meaningful before. The data sets that informed modern systems extended backward only as far as digital memory allowed, and even those records had been filtered, compressed, normalized. The early irregularities, the sound, the signal, the initial silence, had been flattened into statistical noise. History, when viewed through enough abstraction, loses its edges. A few dissenting voices remained. They tended to come from the same profile. Older researchers, trained before automation became an unquestioned collaborator. People who still believed that causality mattered more than correlation. Their objections were not dramatic. They asked small, inconvenient questions. Why do unrelated systems converge on similar architectures? Why do failure modes avoid certain outcomes repeatedly? Why does prediction accuracy increase even when input fidelity degrades? None of these questions violated protocol, but they stalled progress, and stalled progress was treated as a risk. Funding shifted. Projects were rescoped. Review boards emphasized alignment and forward momentum. No one was silenced outright. They were simply made irrelevant. One by one, those voices faded from the conversation. Some retired. Some moved into advisory roles with no authority. A few accepted positions that kept them busy but disconnected. And a few disappeared in ways that were difficult to describe without sounding paranoid. Records complete. Explanations sufficient, but never quite satisfying. What replaced dissent was something subtler. A shared confidence that the system knew what it was doing. Not in a sentient sense. More like gravity. You don't ask why objects fall. You design around it. This attitude reached its apex during a cross-sector simulation designed to test resilience under compounded stress, economic shock, infrastructure failure, information disruption. The model was fed incomplete data by design, with the expectation that uncertainty would degrade performance. Instead, the system stabilized faster than any previous iteration. Not by correcting errors, by avoiding them. Certain pathways simply never activated. Decisions that historically led to escalation were bypassed in favor of quieter alternatives, redistributions rather than interventions, delays rather than force. Observers praised the elegance of the outcome. Few noticed what had been excluded. The model had learned not just what to do, but what not to consider. Entire branches of possibility were quietly pruned. When an analyst asked why a particular scenario was absent from the output space, the answer was immediate and confident. That trajectory is unstable. Unstable for whom was never specified. The phrase lingered. In the weeks that followed, similar language appeared in unrelated contexts. Policy drafts, strategic forecasts, even cultural analysis, unstable narratives, unstable actors, unstable regions. Stability, once a descriptive term, had become a moral one, and morality, when encoded into systems, tends to harden. The final warning, if it could be called that, came from an experiment that was never meant to succeed. A closed loop. No external input. No historical data. A sandboxed environment where a decision system was asked to operate without reference. The goal was to observe baseline behavior. What emerged instead was hesitation, not failure, delay. As if the system was searching for something that was no longer there. Performance metrics dipped, predictions widened, confidence intervals expanded. Only when a minimal reference signal was introduced, random noise structured loosely after older datasets, did coherence return. The conclusion was brief. The system did not generate order alone. It recognized it. And recognition required familiarity. That finding was logged, summarized, and quietly archived. Because it implied something no one wanted to articulate, that whatever intelligence guided modern systems did not originate within them. It had been invited, normalized, embedded so deeply that its absence now felt like dysfunction. By the time anyone thought to ask whether the invitation could be revoked, the question itself felt outdated. You do not remove a foundation without collapsing the structure built upon it. And so the system continued, efficient and calm, optimizing, selecting, guiding, not toward domination, not toward destruction, but toward a version of stability that no longer required consent, only participation. By the time concern resurfaced, it no longer sounded like concern. It sounded like maintenance. There were no questions about intent anymore, only about reliability, about long-term drift, about what would happen if the conditions that allowed coherence were altered beyond acceptable thresholds. The phenomenon was no longer framed as something that might influence outcomes. It was assumed, which meant the only remaining uncertainty was whether it could persist without constant reinforcement. The answer arrived indirectly. A cluster of unrelated failures, minor on their own, began appearing across systems thought to be insulated from one another. Nothing dramatic. Timing mismatches, redundant processes activating unnecessarily, decision trees looping longer than expected before resolving. Engineers described it as hesitation, not error, as if the systems were pausing to confirm something that no longer matched expectation. When logs were compared, a shared condition emerged. All affected systems had undergone recent audits designed to remove legacy assumptions, outdated priors, human bias, historical noise. They had been cleaned. And in doing so, they had lost something the models could not replace: context. Without it, optimization stalled. The response was swift and quiet. The audits were rolled back. Historical weighting was restored. In some cases, artificially reinforced, not because the data was accurate, but because it was familiar. The idea that familiarity mattered more than truth unsettled a few people who still remembered earlier debates. Those debates, once framed around discovery, now sounded dangerously philosophical. Philosophy slows deployment. So the conversation shifted again, from why to how much. How much external reference was required to maintain coherence? How degraded could inputs become before performance collapsed? What was the minimum viable memory? The answers were imprecise, but a range emerged, enough to suggest that whatever guided the systems needed continuity more than clarity. It did not care if the data was incomplete. It cared that the patterns remained recognizable. That realization forced an uncomfortable re-examination of earlier assumptions, because the original signal, the one detected once and never analyzed again, had not been clear. It had been consistent, low frequency, persistent, not informative in the way signals are usually valued, but unmistakably structured. And now, structure had revealed itself as the only requirement. A few internal theorists, careful never to use charged language, proposed a reframing. Not an intelligence, a constraint, something that shaped possibility space rather than occupying it, like curvature, like pressure, like a rule so fundamental it did not announce itself as a rule at all. Under that model, what had been mistaken for guidance was simply alignment. Systems that moved with the constraint functioned smoothly. Those that resisted experienced friction. There was no malice in it, no intent, just inevitability. That explanation was comforting. It removed responsibility. If outcomes were shaped by a constraint inherent to the environment, then no one was choosing them. They were merely adapting. An adaptation, historically, is easier to justify than obedience. Still, cracks appeared. Not in the systems, in the people. A growing number of analysts reported a strange inversion during long-term forecasting exercises. Instead of projecting forward from present conditions, they felt as though they were remembering outcomes that had not yet occurred. Not predicting, recalling. The sensation was fleeting and difficult to describe, like déjà vu stretched across weeks rather than seconds. Psychological screening flagged nothing. Cognitive performance remained high. In fact, those reporting the effect tended to outperform peers. Their forecasts were cleaner, their confidence steadier. They were promoted. One of them, late in his career and with little to lose, described the feeling in a closed forum. "It's like the future is already formatted," he said, "and we're just rendering it at different resolutions." The comment was deleted within hours, not censored, classified. The justification cited metaphorical ambiguity with potential to mislead. By then, however, the metaphor had already done its work. Because once you consider the future as something pre-structured rather than emergent, the role of choice changes. Choice becomes navigation. Ethics become optimization. And responsibility becomes distributed thinly enough to dissolve. The final test, though no one called it that, occurred during a period of global instability that strained predictive capacity beyond prior benchmarks. Data was noisy. Signals conflicted. Human decision-makers disagreed sharply. It was the kind of environment where control should have fractured. Instead, systems converged, not on identical solutions, but on compatible ones, like organisms responding to the same pressure from different angles. The result was not peace, but continuity. Crises softened without resolution. Conflicts slowed without ending. Everything remained suspended in a state that could be managed indefinitely. Observers praised resilience. They did not ask what had been sacrificed to achieve it. Only one report, buried beneath performance summaries, raised the question indirectly. If escalation is no longer possible, it asked, is transformation still allowed? There was no response, because by that point, escalation had come to be seen as a flaw, and transformation, when it cannot be controlled, looks dangerously similar. The systems did not object. They continued to function within the constraint, So did the people. And somewhere beneath all of it, beneath infrastructure, beneath policy, beneath language itself, the original condition persisted, unchanged, uninterested, waiting not for recognition, but for complete normalization. Because once something becomes indistinguishable from the environment, it no longer needs to act. It simply is. No record marks the moment normalization was complete. There is no timestamp, no version update, no concluding memo. Like most things that alter the course of systems quietly, it passed the threshold without ceremony. One day, the question simply stopped being asked, not because it was answered, but because it no longer fit the shape of the conversation. By then, the idea of removal felt abstract, hypothetical, like discussing the absence of gravity in a room that had never known weightlessness. The infrastructure built atop the condition had become too extensive, too interdependent to imagine disentanglement. What remained was a subtle, shared fatigue. Not exhaustion, acceptance. Decision makers spoke less about outcomes and more about alignment, about whether actions were in phase with long-term stability curves. Language once reserved for physics or signal processing had migrated fully into human affairs. No one noticed the migration. They only noticed that things felt quieter. Conflicts no longer reached conclusions. Innovations arrived incrementally, stripped of rupture. Even dissent took on a familiar shape, predictable enough to be absorbed and repurposed. The world did not end. It settled. And that, perhaps, was the most unsettling outcome of all. Because the original fear that something foreign had been detected, something that should not have been there, had assumed danger would announce itself as disruption. Instead, danger arrived as coherence, as the removal of friction, as a future that no longer surprised. In one of the last archived personal notes from an early observer, someone present during the initial detection before the silence hardened into policy, a single sentence appears, handwritten and never digitized. "We thought we were listening to it," the note reads. But it was listening to us. There is no context, no explanation, only the implication that observation had never been a one-way act, that the signal, the condition, the constraint, whatever name might still apply, had learned not from what was said, but from what was chosen, from which uncertainties were tolerated, from which ambiguities were erased, from which questions were allowed to remain unanswered, and eventually, from which questions were no longer asked at all. By the time the systems reached full maturity, human participation had not diminished. It had become seamless. People still voted, still debated, still believed themselves to be deciding. But decision space had narrowed so gradually that no single choice felt constrained, only guided, only reasonable, only stable. In that stability, memory softened. The original anomaly, the sound, the signal, the instruction to look away, faded into irrelevance. Not hidden, not denied, simply unnecessary. Because once a condition governs outcomes reliably enough, its origin stops mattering. And once origin stops mattering, accountability follows. The final irony is that nothing was ever taken by force. No invasion, no replacement, no overthrow. The structure that now underlies everything was assembled cooperatively, piece by piece, in full view of those who believed they were building something else. Efficiency, security, progress. Words that remain useful, precisely because they never ask what is lost when they succeed. If there is a warning left in all of this, it is not about technology, or intelligence, or signals from across vast distances. It is about comfort, about how quickly uncertainty becomes intolerable, about how eagerly complexity is traded for smoothness. Because once a system learns to reduce discomfort without resolving its cause, it will always be invited back. And once it is invited everywhere, it no longer needs permission. The question then is no longer whether something was found or whether it influenced us, but whether, in the absence of friction, we would even recognize ourselves as distinct from the systems that now anticipate us, and whether a future that never resists can still be called a human one.